On a cold morning in January 1588, as the sun crawled over the frost-bitten roofs of London, Queen Elizabeth, I prepared for yet another meeting with her war council. England stood on the edge of catastrophe. The Spanish Armada loomed over Europe. Diplomats scrambled for alliances, and the Queen's every decision determined the fate of her island kingdom. Courtiers rushed through the echoing chambers of Whitehall Palace, each man breathless with urgency. But behind those walls trimmed with gold, behind the velvet gowns and glittering jewels that made Elizabeth the Virgin Queen a symbol of power and purity, lay a truth few dared whisper. She was one of the least hygienic monarchs in all of European history. If a courtier were to step inside the Queen's private chambers that morning, he would have been struck not by royal fragrance, but by a pungent, suffocating odor. The sweet perfumes drifting from bowls of rosewater and lavender fought desperately to mask something far darker. The natural scent of a monarch who bathed only a handful of times a year, slept in beds crawling with grime, and lived amid habits modern audiences would find revolting. To understand how Elizabeth I could rule with unmatched dignity, while simultaneously engaging in practices that today would shock any listener, one must step back into the world she inherited. The backdrop of an unsanitary age, the England of the late 16th century, was not a world designed for cleanliness. Streets were narrow channels of mud and manure. Chamber pots were dumped from windows into public walkways. Dead animals lay in alleyways until scavengers dragged them off. And the Thames River was so polluted that even sailors avoided drinking from it. In a time before germ theory, before running water, before soap was widely used for personal hygiene, filth was not simply common, it was expected. Even the nobility, with access to wealth and servants, lived within this larger culture of dirt. But Elizabeth's habits went beyond the norms of the age. Her lifestyle was shaped not only by Tudor England's poor sanitation, but also by a lifetime of political danger, emotional trauma, and the relentless pressure to project an image of divine monarchy. Elizabeth's childhood had been soaked in fear. At 2.5 years old, she lost her mother, Anne Boleyn, to the executioner's sword. She grew up surrounded by spies, plots, and courtiers who might one day betray her. By the time she took the throne in 1558, she believed deeply that any act revealing vulnerability could destroy her. Cleanliness, bathing, exposing her body in any form, even to trusted servants, all seemed like unnecessary risks. Thus the myths of the Virgin Queen were built upon layers of silk, jewels, and powder, but beneath them were layers of something far more unpleasant. The first habit, a queen who rarely bathed in her private letters, Elizabeth once remarked that she bathed once a month, whether needed or not. But even this may have been an exaggeration meant to present herself as refined. Many of her closest attendants recorded that she sometimes went months without a full bath, relying instead on dabbing herself with perfumed cloths. The very idea of bathing terrified much of Europe. Doctors insisted that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Public bathhouses, once popular, had become associated with plague and immorality. Monarchs across the continent preferred to hide their natural odors with perfumes rather than risk water touching their skin. Elizabeth followed this medical advice to the extreme. She used rosewater, lavender, violet, orange blossom, and occasionally spices to create a fragrant cloak around herself. Yet when long days of court audiences, political briefings, horse rides, or summer heat passed, her ladies in waiting often found themselves struggling to freshen a body that had not touched a tub in far too long. But the Queen did not view this as dirt. She viewed it as preservation. Germs had not yet been discovered. Disease was believed to emerge from bad air, and good fragrances were thought to fight it. For Elizabeth, perfume was medicine. The second habit, never changing her gowns, another striking detail of Elizabeth's hygiene, was her reluctance to change her clothing. The Queen possessed over 2,000 gowns embroidered with pearls, gold thread, and precious stones, yet she often wore the same dress repeatedly for weeks. The combination of sweat, perfume, dyes, and heavy fabrics created an odor so strong that some ambassadors privately mentioned it in their letters home. But clothing was political power. Her dresses were symbols of monarchy, not mere garments. Each time she wore one, she reinforced her image as England's eternal virgin, the monarch whose body belonged not to any man, but to her kingdom. Changing her gown too often, revealing her body in the process, would have violated her myth. Her servants, therefore, scrubbed and perfumed dresses instead of replacing them. The result was a wardrobe that smelled of herbs on the surface, but of something far less pleasant beneath. The third habit, a royal smile rotten behind Pearl Elizabeth's teeth, were perhaps the most infamous part of her hygiene. By the time she was in her late 30s, she had already lost several teeth to rot. Sugar, a rare and expensive luxury imported from the Caribbean and Mediterranean, became fashionable in England during her reign. The Queen adored it. She ate sugary marzipan, candied violets, honey cakes, sweet wine, and fruit preserves, consuming more sugar in 1 week than many subjects tasted in a year. This addiction destroyed her teeth. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Venice wrote that when she smiled, they sometimes struggled to understand her words through the gaps and decay. By the 1590s, chewing had become painful, and she relied on soft foods. Her courtiers pretended not to notice. After all, criticizing the Queen's appearance was treasonous. But rumors spread through London. The monarch who ruled with an iron will had a breath strong enough to empty a room. The fourth habit, a head full of powder and filth to maintain her iconic pale face and fiery red hair, Elizabeth coated her skin with lead, based white paint and her wigs with fragrant powders. But beneath her wigs her real hair suffered. Some accounts suggest she rarely washed her scalp. The mixture of sweat, wig glue, powder, and natural oils created a breeding ground for lice. Her ladies combed her wigs for hours. They dusted them with scented powders to disguise any odor. But the Queen herself avoided water on her scalp, just as she avoided it on her skin. This practice was not unusual in the Tudor court, yet Elizabeth's extreme use of cosmetics made her situation worse. Every time she appeared in public, she added another layer of white paint, another layer of rouge, another cloud of perfume. Beneath the surface, her skin cracked, blistered, and aged rapidly. The fifth habit, a beady no modern person would approach, perhaps the most shocking of her hygiene habits, concerned her sleeping quarters. Contrary to modern assumptions, Tudor beds were rarely cleaned. Feathers decomposed, straw mattresses trapped moisture, and fleas and lice thrived. Elizabeth's bed, despite its silk coverings and velvet hangings, was no exception. She slept surrounded by cushions and blankets that absorbed years of sweat and perfume. Because she feared draughts, her windows were kept tightly shut, leaving her chambers smelling of stale air and the residue of powders, oils, and sweat. Even her beloved lapdogs, which she often allowed into her bed, added their own odors. To Elizabeth, these animals provided comfort in a ruthless world, but they also contributed to a sleeping environment few modern audiences would tolerate for even one night. The consequence of her lifestyle despite these habits, Elizabeth projected the image of a radiant monarch. Her people adored her. Ambassadors both feared her political brilliance and admired her charisma. Poets praised her beauty, calling her a goddess, a virgin, a lioness. Yet behind all of this lay a simple truth. She ruled a world without modern hygiene and embraced practices that kept her safe, beautiful, and powerful in the only way her culture understood. But as the Armada approached in 1588, and as Elizabeth prepared to give her legendary speech at Tilbury, the contradiction between her myth and her private reality grew sharper. The Queen, who would stand before soldiers as the embodiment of English courage, was also a woman surrounded by odors, rot, powders, and filth she believed were necessary for survival. This was not only her own legacy, it was a window into the darker side of Renaissance royalty. In the blistering summer heat of 1590, when England pulsed with the tension of political rivals, foreign spies, and plague outbreaks creeping through crowded alleyways, Queen Elizabeth I moved through her private chambers like a figure carved from marble and myth, never allowing even her closest attendants to glimpse how deeply her hygiene habits shaped both her physical life and the inner workings of her court. Beneath the iconic layers of white makeup and shimmering jewels, the Queen's body bore the marks of a world without modern sanitation, and every attempt the palace made to protect her only intensified the strange, elaborate rituals that grew around her. One of the most unsettling realities was how rarely her bedding was changed. While today's listeners might imagine a royal household equipped with armies of maids laundering sheets daily, the truth was far darker. Tudor laundry practices were brutal, involving harsh lye, boiling water, and endless manual scrubbing. And because fabrics were expensive and fragile, bedding was changed infrequently, sometimes once every few months, meaning that Elizabeth often slept in linens carrying weeks of oils from her skin, residue from her perfumes, and whatever insects or dust had gathered in the night. Over time, these beds became warm sanctuaries for lice, fleas, and mites that thrived in environments where cleaning was considered dangerous or unnecessary. Her servants attempted to counter this by stuffing her mattresses with herbs such as rosemary, mint, and lavender, believing strong smells could ward off illness. But these scents only mingled with the odors already trapped in the layers of fabric and feathers. Ironically, these aromatic herbs, once symbols of purity, became the very things that revealed her chamber's hidden stench, because the pleasant notes could not fully mask the deeper, sour undertones of a bed that lacked regular washing. By this period in her reign, Elizabeth was also known for her obsession with maintaining perfect control over her public image, and this extended to her face, which she masked with thick layers of white lead paint. The makeup, which cracked and decayed her skin over many years, created a cycle in which she needed more paint to conceal the damage caused by the paint itself. The thick cosmetic paste clung to her pores, blocking natural oils and trapping dirt. Removing it required harsh mixtures of vinegar, egg whites, and mercury, which peeled away the surface of her skin, leaving raw patches vulnerable to infection. Because these treatments were painful and could inflame her face, she often avoided removing the paint entirely, going to sleep with yesterday's cosmetics still hardened on her cheeks, only to add fresh layers the next morning. Her attendants described the difficulty of cleaning her face, especially as she aged, when her skin became increasingly fragile and sensitive. The buildup of paint created a texture similar to clay, cracking in the heat of summer, flaking during long audiences, and collecting traces of sweat and perfume. Yet Elizabeth insisted on appearing in public with a smooth, ghostly pallor, one she believed symbolized purity, virginity, and divine authority. Every time she spoke before her council or confronted an ambassador, she wore a mask of powder that hid her true skin beneath layers of residue and damage. Another revolting habit involved her hands. Elizabeth was known to chew her nails, especially during moments of intense political tension. Her stress was understandable, given the constant threats to her life, from Catholic plots to foreign invasions, but in an age without modern hygiene, nail-biting was a dangerous behavior. Her fingers, already coated in powder and rouge, gathered grime beneath the nails, and the mixture of cosmetics, oils, and dirt entered her mouth every time she chewed them. Her ladies in waiting wrote discreetly about this habit, noting that during arguments with the Privy Council, she often lifted her hand to her lips, gnawing with small, rapid motions, unaware of how it appeared to those around her. The Queen believed that such gestures showed thoughtfulness rather than nerves, but courtiers who stood close enough often saw the faint smudges of red and white paint smeared on her fingertips afterward. Doctors of the age warned against touching the face or mouth with unwashed hands, though their reasons were based on miasma theory rather than germ theory. They believed that harmful vapors from the environment could cling to the skin and enter the body through any exposed openings. While their theory was flawed, their warnings still held truth. Elizabeth's habit of biting her nails almost certainly exposed her to bacteria and infections, yet she saw it as a harmless quirk she had carried since childhood. Then there was her relationship with the palace's makeshift toilets, often referred to as close stools. These were wooden chairs with padded seats and openings beneath, where servants placed removable bowls lined with herbs. While the Queen had access to the most luxurious version of this device, the reality remained unpleasant. Human waste accumulated quickly, and despite the efforts of a groom of the stool. A highly trusted courtier responsible for managing her toilet needs, odors lingered in her private quarters. The bowls were not always emptied immediately, and in an era without modern plumbing, the stench often settled into fabrics, curtains, and carpets. Elizabeth avoided public latrines because she despised being vulnerable in the presence of others, preferring instead to use her private stool. This meant her servants often carried waste through palace hallways, risking spills and attracting flies. Even though they cleaned it as best they could, nothing could eliminate the underlying odor of ammonia and human scent that clung to the enclosed space. One of the most shocking habits of Elizabeth's hygiene revolved around her dental care, or lack thereof. By the later years of her reign, the Queen's gums were severely infected from years of sugar consumption, and infection often produced foul breath and chronic pain. Her physicians attempted rudimentary treatments using vinegar, burnt alum, and crushed herbs, but these methods only offered temporary relief. Because dentistry was primitive, removing teeth was risky and often deadly. The Queen's fear of pain kept her from undergoing regular extractions, leading to the decay of surrounding teeth and gums. Ambassadors documented that during lengthy discussions, her speech became increasingly slurred, her mouth unable to close properly as teeth shifted or fell out. Yet no one dared mention it in her presence. To do so would be to insult the living symbol of England's power. Her love of perfumes, though legendary, also contributed to her hygiene issues. Elizabeth believed that surrounding herself with powerful scents would protect her from disease. As a result, she demanded that her rooms be filled with constantly replenished bowls of fragrant mixtures. These perfumes, while initially pleasant, combined over time with sweat, dust, and natural oils to form a thick, almost cere, like residue on the surfaces of her chambers. Servants wiped her furniture daily, but the sweet, heavy scent seeped into the wood, fabrics, and even the stone floors. After years of this practice, her private rooms developed a cloying smell that visitors found overwhelming. Perfume was not merely decoration for Elizabeth, but a shield against death itself, and in her desperation for protection, she drowned her surroundings in it. Food hygiene presented another hidden issue. The Queen had a habit of snacking constantly, not because she was indulgent, but because she suffered from anxiety that suppressed her appetite during formal meals. She often stored small sweets or pieces of candied fruit in pockets sewn inside her sleeves. Over time, these pockets collected sticky residue, crumbs, and in some cases, insects attracted to the sugar. Her dresses were rarely washed, so the remnants of old treats remained, mixing with the perfumes, powders, and natural odors already trapped in the fabric. The result was a scent that no modern audience would associate with monarchy, a mixture of sugar, sweat, decaying fabric, and aromatic oils. And yet, despite all these habits, Elizabeth I commanded absolute loyalty, inspired poets, terrified enemies, and carved her legend into the bedrock of world history. Her hygiene, or lack of it, was invisible beneath the armor of her public persona. She understood better than anyone that power was not maintained by physical cleanliness, but by psychological mastery. As long as she remained untouchable, radiant, and larger than life in the eyes of her people, the truth inside her chambers would never weaken her rule. By the mid-1590s, when Queen Elizabeth I entered the final decade of her reign, the mythology surrounding her had grown into something almost supernatural, yet the truth of her daily life had become even more haunting. This was the period when the court at Whitehall, Richmond, and Greenwich began whispering more frequently about the increasingly powerful smells drifting through the Queen's private chambers. Elizabeth, once vibrant and commanding, was now aging rapidly behind layers of cosmetics, powders, oils, and perfumes that covered a reality few dared to acknowledge. The Virgin Queen had spent so many years constructing an image of divine purity that the efforts required to maintain the illusion often produced the opposite effect. Her closest ladies in waiting knew the truth most intimately, for they were the ones who handled her gowns, cleaned her bedding, prepared her cosmetic mixtures, and attempted with limited success to maintain an appearance of cleanliness in a world where hygiene was still centuries behind modern. Understanding what they witnessed were not flaws born of negligence, but the byproduct of a deeply political existence. Every decision about her body was shaped not by comfort, but by security, superstition, and the harsh demands of monarchy. Queen's hygiene, already questionable by modern standards, grew more troubling as she approached 60 years old. Her skin, long exposed to toxic white lead paint, had begun to crack in fine lines and patches of discoloration. But she refused to appear without makeup, believing her bare skin revealed weakness that enemies could exploit. Thus her ladies would apply new layers of paint over old, mixing vinegar, egg whites, and crushed pearls into a paste that masked imperfections while suffocating her skin further. Under the bright candlelight of the court, the Queen's face would glow pale and regal, but up close, the mixture hardened into a stiff, chalky texture that clung to every wrinkle. Removing the paint would require scrubbing with linen cloths soaked in rosewater and wine, a process Elizabeth dreaded because it peeled her skin painfully. As a result, she often slept with remnants of the paint still on her face, transferring traces onto her pillows and bedding. Her chambers carried the lingering smell of vinegar, sweat, powder, and musty fabric that even heavy perfumes could not fully disguise. Her teeth had deteriorated so severely by this era that ambassadors remarked more openly, though discreetly, about the difficulty of understanding her speech. The Queen's fondness for sugar had only intensified with age, resulting in increasingly painful dental infections. Her physicians, lacking modern tools, could do little beyond extracting teeth or prescribing herbal rinses that offered little relief. Some reports suggest Elizabeth occasionally stuffed cotton soaked in sweets, melting oils into gaps left by tooth loss to disguise the odor, further contributing to the sweetness, sourness combination that drifted from her breath. Her gums became inflamed, and chewing roasted meats or crusty bread grew difficult, pushing her toward softer foods that did little to improve her oral health. Yet she refused to reduce her sugar intake, for sweets had become one of her few comforts in a life defined by political pressure and emotional deprivation. Courtiers loyal to her pretended not to notice the odor, while foreign diplomats, constrained by etiquette, simply noted it privately in coded letters. Still, the legend of her charm continued. Even with failing teeth and obvious discomfort, Elizabeth could silence a room with her wit, her intelligence, and the sheer force of her presence. Her wigs, already notorious for accumulating sweat and powder, now required even more maintenance. The Queen, increasingly self-conscious about her thinning natural hair, demanded elaborate curls, red dyes, and floral powders to maintain the illusion of youthful radiance. Her wig-makers created structures that grew heavier each year, shaped into coils and braids that reached impressive heights. But beneath them, her scalp often went unwashed for weeks. The glue used to secure the wigs mixed with natural oils, leading to irritation and a foul smell that her ladies fought tirelessly to conceal with spices, herbs, and ground orris root. On humid days, the mixture clumped unpleasantly, and her wigs absorbed even more moisture, creating a damp scent that lingered in the Queen's presence no matter how many rose petals were scattered around the room. Still, courtiers praised her eternal beauty, for to question it was to risk treason. Her gowns, already known for being worn repeatedly, became even more problematic as she aged. Heavy embroidery and layered skirts decreased her mobility, causing her to sweat more easily during long ceremonies or warm days. Without regular bathing, the sweat soaked into the lining of her dresses, mixing with perfume and dust until the fabric itself carried a permanent scent. Some of her older gowns became so rank that they were nearly impossible to clean fully, even when aired out for days or beaten by servants attempting to remove the smell. Yet Elizabeth insisted on wearing the same iconic favorites repeatedly, believing certain gowns granted her luck or authority during diplomatic meetings. Changing her clothing too often seemed frivolous to her, especially when each gown symbolized an aspect of her political identity. In a time when a monarch's appearance was a language of power, the Queen's wardrobe became her armor. Unfortunately, that armor trapped years' worth of sweat and grime within its folds. Her sleeping arrangements, already uncomfortable due to her refusal to air out her chambers, worsened as she aged. She became paranoid about drafts and illnesses, keeping her windows shut and her fireplaces burning even in mild weather. The combination of heat, poor ventilation, and old bedding created a stifling atmosphere. Servants noted that entering her chambers in the morning often felt like stepping into a cloud of stale perfume mixed with the smell of worn cloth and human sweat. Her mattresses, rarely replaced, grew dense with moisture and oil. Fleas and lice, common across Europe at the time, multiplied in these warm, dark spaces. Though her attendants attempted to clean the bedding with herbs like lavender and mint, the scent of decay often remained. Elizabeth tolerated it because she saw any disruption to her sleeping arrangements as potentially dangerous. Her mother had been murdered in a palace. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, had been executed after years of imprisonment. Elizabeth viewed her bedroom as both sanctuary and potential trap, and any change made her uneasy. Her fear of bathing intensified in her older years. She had absorbed decades of medical warnings claiming that water weakened the body, softened the flesh, and invited illness. When her physicians suggested warm water to soothe her aching joints, she refused, insisting instead on dry, washing with scented cloths. But these cloths only redistributed dirt across her skin, mixing with powders and oils until her body felt perpetually sticky. Her attendants noticed the build-up, but remained silent. Their loyalty was absolute, and their fear of angering the Queen even greater. Only her most trusted ladies ever glimpsed the reality of her physical condition, and they guarded the secret as fiercely as they protected her political reputation. As her hygiene worsened, so did the health risks around her. The Tudor court was already a breeding ground for disease, and stagnant chambers filled with unwashed fabrics created ideal environments for infections. The Queen herself suffered recurrent fevers, tooth abscesses, and skin irritation. Yet despite all this, Elizabeth remained mentally sharp and politically commanding. Her ability to govern in such conditions was a testament to her resilience. While her body aged and her environment decayed, her mind remained formidable. She negotiated treaties, crushed rebellions, and oversaw the cultural flourishing now known as the Elizabethan Golden Age. What makes her hygiene so shocking today is not simply that it was unpleasant, but that it coexisted with one of the most celebrated images of royal purity and strength in European history. Elizabeth's filth did not diminish her power. Instead, it revealed the immense cost of maintaining monarchy in a world without modern knowledge. Behind the glowing portraits, the embroidered gowns, and the poetic praises lay a woman fighting to preserve her dignity while trapped inside the limits of her era. Her hygiene was not a personal failing but a reflection of the brutal realities of 16th century life. And as Elizabeth moved closer to death, this contradiction only grew stronger, shaping the final chapter of her legendary reign. In the final years of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, as the 1,590s bled into the new century, and the once undefeated monarch aged into her late 60s, the darker truths of her personal hygiene became more painfully visible to everyone around her. The dazzling queen who had ruled with unmatched charisma began to retreat behind curtains of perfume, powders, and myth, even as the world she had shaped trembled under the weight of famine, war debt, and political uncertainty. By 1600, Londoners whispered that their virgin queen was no longer the radiant figure who had once ridden to Tilbury to face the Spanish threat. The jewel-covered gowns hung heavier upon her failing body, the lead paint on her face cracked more deeply with every forced smile, and the reddish wigs that had defined her royal image sat stiffly atop a scalp now fragile and damaged from decades of powders and unwashed oils. Her courtiers maintained her illusions because they had no other choice. The Queen's image was not merely vanity, it was the stability of the English throne. A monarch was the heart of the state, and if the heart appeared weak or decaying, then the kingdom might crumble around it. This was why her ladies, in waiting, continued the exhausting rituals that surrounded her. They layered sweets, melting herbs inside her gowns, brushed her wigs with lavender and violet powder, and refreshed her bed hangings with rosewater, all to preserve a fiction the Queen refused to abandon. But those who worked closely with her also saw the consequences of a lifetime without proper hygiene. Her skin, long painted with white lead, began to peel away in painful flakes. Beneath the paint lay darkened patches, sores, and burns caused by the chemical mixtures she had relied on for beauty. At times the pain was so severe that she ordered her physicians to scrape the thick makeup from her cheeks, only to insist the same toxic paste be reapplied hours later before she faced her council or any visiting ambassadors. Her cracked teeth worsened, and the rotting roots beneath them caused fevers, migraines, and an unmistakable odor that even her most loyal attendants struggled to tolerate in the confined rooms of Richmond and Greenwich palaces. Her breath grew so foul that foreign envoys recorded in private correspondence how difficult it was to stand close enough to speak with her, though their faces in public remained full of respect and admiration. They understood that to grimace or step back would be to insult the most powerful woman in Europe. Yet the Queen herself refused treatment beyond simple tooth powders and clove oil, clinging to the belief that any aggressive medical intervention might be dangerous or weaken her further. Meanwhile, her sleeping chambers grew more suffocating as she aged. Elizabeth's lifelong fear of cold air became nearly pathological. She ordered windows sealed, fireplaces overstuffed with logs, and curtains drawn tightly around her bed, trapping every scent of her unwashed body, every trace of perfume, every breath of stale air. Her maids struggled to air the mattresses discreetly, but the Queen often woke in a panic if she discovered a window had been opened even by an inch. The combination of heat, heavy fabrics, unbathed skin, and tightly packed bedding created a miasma no modern audience could imagine. But to Elizabeth this was necessary protection. Physicians of the era insisted that cold draughts caused illness, so she believed her survival depended on shutting the outside world away. The irony was painful. The monarch who had once faced down invading armies now feared fresh air more than any enemy. By 1601, her body had begun to fail her in ways that even perfumes could not disguise. The thick cosmetics she wore slowed the healing of her damaged skin. The untreated infections in her mouth spread to her jaw. Her thinning hair grew brittle, and the wigs once worn as symbols of majesty became physical burdens she could scarcely endure for long audiences. Still, she refused to alter the routines she had followed her entire life. Cleanliness, in her view, remained a medical danger, and bathing remained a threat to the carefully crafted myth of her divine presence. But there was another reason behind her refusal to modernize her habits. Elizabeth had spent a lifetime controlling every element of her image. She was the Virgin Queen, the mother of the nation, the woman who belonged to no man and therefore belonged to England itself. To reveal weakness, to permit others to treat or handle her body in intimate ways, felt like a betrayal of everything she had cultivated. She believed that the myth of her purity and power was inseparable from the physical rituals she practiced. Perfume meant strength, paint meant majesty, silence about her own discomfort meant authority, cleanliness to her meant risk, and so she clung to the filth behind the silk, long after her courtiers knew it was killing her. Late in 1602, she entered a deep depression. The death of her beloved friend and rumoured soulmate, the Earl of Essex, who had been executed for treason 2 years earlier, had shattered what little joy remained in her life. She stopped sleeping properly, refused to lie in her bed for long stretches, and instead paced anxiously for hours in darkened rooms. She removed many of her jewels and dismissed musicians she once adored. She rarely spoke. Her ladies reported that she seemed to shrink, physically and spiritually, as though the weight of the crown, the burden of her myth, and the reality of her failing body had finally grown too heavy to bear. During this decline, her hygiene deteriorated further. She resisted being changed, resisted being washed, resisted even the simplest grooming rituals that kept her presentable during her final audiences. Her attendants whispered their worries but obeyed her wishes, knowing she was nearing the end. By March 1603, she could no longer hide from the truth she had long denied. Her illnesses, worsened by decades of unclean skin, toxic cosmetics, and untreated infections, overwhelmed her. Too weak to stand, she allowed herself to be carried to her bed, the very place she had avoided for days. Surrounded by her privy chamber women, she lay upon the same layers of perfumed cushions that had absorbed years of sweat and sickness. Her breath came ragged, her skin blotched, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion. Yet even in these final moments, her attendants maintained the rituals of illusion. They brushed scented powder through her thinning wig. They freshened the sheets with rose water. They wiped sweat from her brow with lavender, soaked cloths. They tried, with heartbreaking loyalty, to preserve the image of the queen she had once been. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace after 44 years on the throne. Her passing ended the Tudor dynasty and ushered in the era of the Stuarts. The nation mourned deeply, for despite her private filth, she had given England stability, identity, and strength. Yet her death also revealed the painful cost of a monarch trapped by her own legend. The Virgin Queen, who had ruled with ruthless brilliance and unmatched charisma, had lived and died in a world without modern hygiene, clinging to practices that preserved her power even as they destroyed her health. Her story reminds us that behind the golden glow of royal portraits and the myths of greatness lies a reality far more human, far more fragile, and far more disturbing than the world ever sees.